The evening at my house was proceeding as usual, at least at first glance. I was sitting in my worn leather armchair, which had been standing by the living room window for more than 20 years, pretending to watch another nature program. The announcer was talking in a monotonous voice about bird migration, but my thoughts were not on feathered creatures at all. I turned the TV volume down to almost nothing so I could hear better what was going on in the kitchen. James and Christina had been whispering there for half an hour, pausing occasionally when I coughed or rustled the newspaper. My son and his wife thought I didn't notice anything. That old age had made me deaf and indifferent to the world around me. How wrong they were. At 74, I heard and saw much more than they would have liked. Christina spoke more quietly than usual, but her voice still reached my ears. She had always been a woman of character, and in the 3 years that she and James had lived in my house, I had come to know her mannerisms well. Tall, slender, with neatly styled blonde hair, she knew how to make a decent impression on strangers. But at home, when she thought I wasn't looking, Christina often allowed herself to glance at me with contempt and sigh impatiently. "It has to happen as soon as possible," she whispered, and I tensed, trying not to show that I was listening. "We've been waiting too long." James muttered something in response, but I couldn't make out his words. My son had never been decisive. Even as a child, he preferred someone else to make important decisions for him. First it was me, then his first wife, and now Christina. At 46, he still hadn't learned to take responsibility for himself. I slowly turned the page of the newspaper that was lying on my lap and noticed out of the corner of my eye that Christina had peeked out of the kitchen to check if I was listening to their conversation. I tried hard to look like I was concentrating on reading, even though the letters were blurring before my eyes from the strain. The article was about local news in Oklahoma City, something about a new shopping center and parking problems. The usual city bustle that used to interest me, but now seemed distant and unimportant. "Resolving the issue once and for all," Christina repeated a little louder, as if convincing herself. "No more procrastination." Those words made me shiver. Over the past few months, I had noticed them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking, how they abruptly stopped talking when I entered the room, how Christina examined the furniture and calculated something in her mind. I wasn't paranoid, but years of life had taught me to notice such things. After Margaret's death 2 years ago, the house became empty and filled with a silence that weighed on me every day. James offered to move in with me, supposedly to help with the housework and not leave me alone at such a difficult time. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable decision. The house was large, there was enough room for everyone, and the company of loved ones was supposed to brighten up the loneliness. But very soon I realized that James and Christina saw my house not as a temporary shelter, but as their future property. Christina began rearranging the furniture, changing the curtains, and talking about the need for repairs. When I gently pointed out that I wasn't ready for such changes, she took offense and remained silent for several days. I was particularly concerned about how she began to take an interest in my papers. At first, it seemed like she was just being helpful. Christina offered to help me sort through my documents, organize my folders of important papers, and make a list of doctors and lawyers. But gradually, I noticed that she was studying my bank statements, insurance policies, and other financial documents too closely. And when I once caught her in my office looking at my will, she wasn't embarrassed, but just smiled and said she wanted to make sure all the documents were in their places. The TV was showing commercials, and I took advantage of this to discreetly turn my head toward the kitchen. James was sitting at the table, nervously fiddling with the edge of a napkin, while Christina stood nearby, leaning her hands on the tabletop. Her posture expressed determination, while he looked uncertain. This was typical for them. She made the decisions, and he followed her without complaint. "You understand there's no other way, right?" Christina spoke more quietly, but I could still make out every word. "We can't wait any longer. We need certainty." James nodded, but I could see he was hesitant. My son had always been a gentle person, incapable of cruel acts. But Christina knew how to persuade, and sometimes even force, people to do what she thought was necessary. I saw how she worked with him, gradually winning him over to her point of view. First with gentle persuasion, then with more insistent requests, and if that didn't help, with long explanations about how important it was for their future to make the right decision. "He's already old," Christina continued, and my heart beat faster. He doesn't have much time left. We are young, we need to think about the future. But he's still my father, James objected weakly. Of course, dear, and that's exactly why we have to make sure that his last years are peaceful, in a good place where he will be properly cared for. I tensed up even more. A good place where he would be cared for could only mean one thing: a nursing home. Christina was talking about a nursing home, and I had no idea they had gone so far in their plans. The sound of their approaching footsteps made me quickly bury myself in the newspaper. Christina appeared in the doorway, smiling tensely. She was wearing the beige dress she wore when she wanted to look particularly respectable. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup flawless. She was preparing for an important conversation. "Papa Robert, would you like a cup of tea?" she asked me with the cloying concern she wore like a mask in my presence. "Thank you, dear, but I've already had some," I replied without looking up from the newspaper. "Perhaps something to eat? We have the cookies you like." "Don't worry about it. I'll have dinner later." Christina stood there for a few more seconds, as if thinking about something, and then returned to the kitchen. Their whispering resumed, but now they were speaking even more quietly, and I could only make out a few words. Something about tomorrow evening, and when he falls asleep. These fragments of phrases made me even more alert. I leaned back in my chair and tried to make sense of what I had heard. Resolving the issue once and for all. What could that mean? Were they really planning something serious? Or was I just getting myself worked up, turning a normal family conversation into a conspiracy? But my instincts, honed over years, told me that this was serious. Too many strange things had happened recently. Too often they discussed my needs and conveniences when they thought I couldn't hear them. Christina was too insistent about my documents, the location of my will, and other financial matters. I remembered how a week ago she asked me if I wanted to visit a local nursing home, just to see what the conditions were like there. She said that many people my age find new friends and interesting activities there. I had dismissed the suggestion at the time, but now I realized that it had not been a casual remark, but a way of testing the waters. The announcer on the screen finished talking about birds and moved on to sea creatures. I mechanically switched channels and found the evening news. The presenter reported on tomorrow's weather, promising a sunny day with no precipitation. Then there was sports news, a summary of incidents in the city, and advertisements for local stores. This was the usual information that would not have caught my attention at other times, but now I was clinging to every little thing just so I wouldn't have to think about what might happen. It was starting to get dark outside. The streetlights weren't on yet, but the sun was already setting below the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink. This house had seen many sunsets like this. Margaret loved to sit by this same window and watch as day turned into night. We often spent our evenings like this. She with her needlework, me with my newspaper, and the light slowly fading outside the window. Now everything had changed. The house that was once filled with love and understanding was now inhabited by strangers with strange plans. James was still my son, but Christina had turned him into a puppet who danced to her tune, and I had become an obstacle to their goals. Christina reappeared in the living room, this time accompanied by James. They sat down on the sofa opposite my chair, and I felt the atmosphere in the room change. The air became thicker, heavier. They were preparing for a serious conversation. "Dad," James began, and I could tell from his voice that the conversation was going to be unpleasant. "Christina and I wanted to talk to you about your health." I looked up from the newspaper and looked at them. Christina sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, like a model student in class. James slumped and avoided my gaze, which was typical for him when he felt uncomfortable. "What exactly is bothering you?" I asked calmly, although inside I was tense. "We've noticed that you've become more forgetful," my son continued cautiously. "Sometimes you repeat the same questions, forget where you put things." That wasn't true, and we all knew it. My memory was fine, and the absent-mindedness they attributed to me was the result of my unwillingness to participate in their games. "We're just worried about you," Christina added with feigned warmth. "It's natural at your age, and we want to make sure you get all the help you need." "And what kind of help do you mean?" I asked, already guessing the answer. James looked uncertainly at his wife, waiting for her to take the initiative. "We think it would be good for you to live in a place where you have constant medical supervision," Christina said softly but firmly. where people your age can socialize with each other and participate in various activities. A nursing home, I stated emotionlessly. They're very good facilities, Dad, James hastily added. We've already looked at several options. They have everything you need: medical care, meals, entertainment. And when do you plan to implement this wonderful plan? I spoke calmly, but I felt a cold rage growing inside me. Christina and James exchanged glances. They clearly did not expect me to react so coldly to their proposal. We would like you to visit a few places yourself and choose the one you like best, Christina continued. It should be your decision. My decision. How ironic. They had already decided everything for me, and now they wanted to create the appearance that I was choosing my own destiny. What about the house? I asked, watching their reaction. Well, the house. James paused and looked at his wife again. The house is too big for you alone, and it's expensive to maintain. We think it would be wise to sell it, I finished for him. Not necessarily sell it, Christina said quickly. We could live in it, take care of it, make sure everything is in order. Of course, they would take care of my house while I lived out my days in a government institution among strangers. I was silent, pondering their words. This was the beginning of something bigger. I could feel it with every fiber of my being. They were laying the groundwork for the next step, whatever it might be. And I was beginning to realize that tomorrow might bring unpleasant surprises. Dinner passed in a tense silence that hung between us after our evening conversation. Christina made my favorite meatloaf with mashed potatoes, but the food seemed tasteless, like sawdust in my mouth. I chewed mechanically, thinking about what I had heard and trying to understand how far they were willing to go with their plans. James hardly looked up from his plate, concentrating on cutting the meat into small pieces, which he then chewed for a long time, as if delaying the moment when he would have to speak. Christina, on the other hand, was emphatically lively, talking about the neighbors she had met at the store today, the new restaurant that had opened on the next street, and her plans for the weekend. Her voice sounded too loud in the silence of the dining room, too cheerful for the atmosphere that prevailed in the house. Mrs. Adams said they're repairing the road in their neighborhood, she chirped, serving me extra potatoes, even though I hadn't asked for them. It will be inconvenient for a few weeks, but then the pavement will be like new. I nodded in the right places, occasionally interjecting neutral comments, but my thoughts were far from road repairs. Fragments of the conversation I had overheard that evening were spinning around in my head. Tomorrow evening, when he falls asleep, settle the matter once and for all. What were they planning? And why tomorrow? Margaret always said that I was too suspicious, that I tended to see conspiracies where there were none. Maybe she was right, and I was just an old paranoid who imagined threats that didn't exist. But my instinct for self-preservation, developed over decades of life, was screaming danger. Papa Robert, you're not eating well today, Christina remarked, watching me closely. Is something wrong? Everything's fine, dear. I just don't have the same appetite I used to. That's normal at your age, she nodded understandingly, but it's important to watch your diet. Your body needs strength. Strength. Why would I need strength tomorrow? Or did she mean something else? James finally looked up and stared at me with a strange mixture of pity and determination. I saw something new in that look. He had made a decision. The indecisive, soft expression I was used to seeing had been replaced by a firmer one. Christina had worked thoroughly with him. Father, he said, putting down his fork, we are seriously considering what we talked about last night, about the nursing home. I see. And what exactly have you done? We signed up for a tour of Sunny Hills the day after tomorrow, Christina replied for him. It's a very nice place on the outskirts of town. The conditions are excellent and the staff is qualified. Isn't it too hasty? I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. Dad, we just want to take a look, James interjected. No one is forcing you to move immediately. It's just preparing for the future. Preparing for the future. What if their plans call for that future to arrive much sooner than I think? The rest of dinner passed in relative silence. Christina cleared the table, humming to herself from time to time. A habit that used to seem cute to me, but now annoyed me. James helped her, carefully loading the dishes into the dishwasher. They moved in sync, like a well-rehearsed team, and I felt more and more like an outsider in this picture of domestic bliss. After dinner, I went to my bedroom as usual, The room was at the far end of the hallway, separated from the rest of the house by a heavy oak door that I had installed myself many years ago when Margaret complained about the noise from the living room in the evenings. Now this isolation worked in my favor. I could think quietly without fear of anyone eavesdropping. The bedroom was simply furnished. A large bed that Margaret and I had bought for our silver wedding anniversary, an old chest of drawers with a mirror, an armchair by the window, and a desk where I kept my books and documents. On the walls hung photographs, family pictures from different years, including those from when James was little and looked at me with adoration. I changed into my pajamas and sat down in the armchair, picking up a book about World War II that I had been reading for a week. But I couldn't concentrate on the text. The words blurred before my eyes, and my thoughts returned to the conversation I had overheard and the strange behavior of my family members. I could hear muffled sounds coming from behind the wall. Christina and James were discussing something in the kitchen, then went upstairs to their bedroom. Their voices could be heard from above, but it was impossible to make out the words. After a while, silence fell over the house. I was about to go to bed when I heard a soft knock on the door. "Dad, Robert, can I come in?" Christina's voice rang out. "Of course, dear." The door opened and Christina entered the room, holding a glass of water and a small plastic box of pills. She was wearing a bathrobe and slippers, her hair loose over her shoulders. She looked almost homely, but there was a certain tension in her eyes. "I brought you your blood pressure pills," she said, approaching me. "You forgot to take them after dinner." It was strange. First, I hadn't forgotten to take my pills. I hadn't taken them at all because I didn't have any blood pressure problems. Second, Christina had never shown such concern for my medication before. Usually, everyone took care of their own medical affairs. "Thank you, but I already took them this morning," I said, watching her reaction. No, the doctor said to take them twice a day," she insisted, handing me a glass. "Morning and evening. It's very important at your age." I took the glass and looked at the pills in her palm. They were white, round, with some kind of marking that I couldn't make out in the dim light of the bedroom. They were definitely not the pills Dr. Harrison had prescribed for me as a preventive measure. Those were pink and smaller. "What are these pills?" I asked as innocently as possible. "Just regular ones for blood pressure," Christina replied quickly. "The doctor said you need to take them regularly for prevention." A lie. Dr. Harrison never said anything like that, and my blood pressure was normal at my last checkup a month ago. "Christina, why are you so concerned about my medication today?" I asked, studying her face closely. "I just want to make sure you're taking care of your health," she replied. But there was a false note in her voice. "We're family. We have to take care of each other." Family. Yes, of course. Especially on the eve of a trip to a nursing home. "Of course, dear. You're very thoughtful," I said and took the pills from her palm. Christina watched closely as I put the pills in my mouth and washed them down with water. I took a few sips, pretending to swallow the medicine, but actually hid the pills under my tongue. The water was ordinary with no foreign taste, but the pills left a bitter aftertaste in my mouth. "That's good," Christina said with satisfaction, taking the empty glass from me. "Good night, Papa Robert. Sleep well." "Good night, dear." She left the room, quietly closing the door behind her. I waited until her footsteps faded in the hallway, then quickly went to the bathroom and spit the pills into the sink. The bitter taste remained in my mouth, and I rinsed my mouth several times with water to get rid of the unpleasant sensation. Returning to the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of what had happened. Christina had brought me unknown pills and insisted that I take them. Why? What could they be? Sleeping pills? Sedatives? Or something more serious? I remembered her words in the hallway. "When he falls asleep." Now it took on a new meaning. They wanted me to sleep soundly tonight. But why? My thoughts were confused, forming an alarming picture. A nursing home, pills, whispers about solving the problem once and for all. What were they planning to do while I was asleep under the influence of an unknown drug? I went to the window and looked out onto the street. It was a cool October evening, and the leaves on the trees had already begun to turn yellow. Streetlights illuminated the empty road, with cars passing by occasionally. It was a familiar, peaceful scene that I had seen thousands of times before, but today there was nothing reassuring about it. I returned to the bed, but did not lie down. Instead, I sat down in a chair and waited. If my suspicions were correct, something was bound to happen tonight. And I had to be ready. The clock on the dresser showed 10:30. The house was silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the creaking of the old floorboards. I listened to every sound, trying to understand what was happening in other parts of the house. About an hour later, I heard cautious footsteps in the hallway. Someone was approaching my door very quietly. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and I held my breath. There was silence for a few seconds, and then I heard a faint sound. Someone was very carefully turning the doorknob. The door opened a few centimeters, and Christina peeked through the crack. I quickly closed my eyes and tried to breathe evenly, pretending to be fast asleep. She stood there for a few minutes, watching me, and then quietly closed the door. The footsteps receded, but I didn't relax. Something was bound to happen, and I felt that the most interesting part was just beginning. After Christina left, I sat in the chair for another half hour, listening to the sounds of the house. The old building creaked inside like a living creature, settling down after the heat of the day. I knew these sounds down to the smallest detail. Each floorboard had its own special voice. Each step of the staircase sang its own melody underfoot. Over the long years of living in this house, I had memorized its language. The clock showed 1:45 when I finally heard what I had been waiting for. Cautious footsteps in the hallway, almost inaudible, but distinguishable to my trained ear. Someone was moving from the stairs to my bedroom, trying not to make the slightest noise. The footsteps stopped after each step, as if the person was listening to see if I had woken up. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe evenly and deeply, imitating the sleep of a person under the influence of a sleeping pill. My heart was beating faster than usual, but I forced myself to remain still. A lot depended on how convincingly I could play the role of a sleeping person. The footsteps approached the door itself. I heard someone lean carefully against the wooden panel, listening to the sounds coming from the room. For several long minutes there was silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the dresser. Then there was a faint metallic sound. Someone was very slowly inserting a key into the keyhole. My heart leapt. There was always a key in my bedroom lock, but it was more for privacy than security. Margaret sometimes locked the door when she was changing or wanted to be alone. I never imagined that this lock would one day be used against me. The key turned agonizingly slowly, millimeter by millimeter. Christina, for it was definitely her, was doing her best not to wake me with the sound. The click of the lock when it finally turned all the way seemed deafening in the silence of the night, though in reality it was barely audible. Then there was a pause. Christina was apparently listening again to see if I had woken up. I continued to pretend to be fast asleep, even allowing myself to snore quietly, as people sometimes do when under the influence of strong medication. Satisfied that I was still asleep, Christina moved away from the door, but her steps did not lead back to the stairs, but further down the corridor to the hallway. I knew why she was going there. My set of keys was always on the small table by the front door. The keys to the house, the garage, the shed, all the locks on my property. Those keys were a symbol of my independence, my right to control my own home. And now Christina was taking them away, turning me into a prisoner in my own home. The plan was becoming clearer, although its ultimate goal remained unclear. The footsteps stopped in the hallway and I tensed, trying to hear what was happening. There was a faint clink of metal. Christina was carefully picking up the keys, trying not to let them jingle. Then the footsteps started again, heading back toward the stairs. I waited until the sounds faded completely, and only then did I quietly get up from the chair. Approaching the door, I carefully pressed the handle. As expected, the door would not budge. I was locked in my own bedroom like a naughty child or a sick person who needed to be isolated from the rest of the world. A strange feeling came over me at that moment. On the one hand, I felt indignation and anger at such humiliation. I, the owner of the house, was locked in a room like a criminal or a madman. On the other hand, it was almost a relief that my suspicions had been confirmed. I wasn't paranoid. Something was really being planned against me. I went back to the window and looked out at the night street. The moon was almost full, illuminating the road with a milky light. The neighbor's house across the street was plunged into darkness, with only one window glowing with the bluish light of a television. Mrs. Adams was probably watching the nightly news or old movies. She had a habit of falling asleep in front of the screen. How far was it from my window to the ground? 4 meters, no more. In my youth, I could have easily climbed down the drainpipe or simply jumped, risking at most a minor bruise. But at 74, such a stunt could end in a broken bone, and then I would truly be helpless. No, running out the window was not the best idea. I had to think, plan, wait for the right moment. Christina and James were up to something, but they didn't know that I had figured out their plan. That gave me an advantage that I had to use wisely. I sat back down in the chair and tried to reconstruct the chronology of events. The conversation about the nursing home, the pills that were supposed to put me to sleep, the locked door, and the stolen keys. What next? What did they plan to do with me while they thought I was asleep under the influence of the sleeping pills? The most obvious option was that they wanted to search my documents, find my will, bank papers, and insurance policies. But most of the important documents were in a safe deposit box at the bank, and only copies were kept at home. Christina knew this because I had told her myself when she first showed interest in my papers. Maybe they were planning something to make it look like an accident. But then why the sleeping pills? A dead man doesn't need to be put to sleep. Most likely they wanted to create a situation in which I would appear incapable of making decisions on my own. An old man who forgets to take his medicine, locks himself in his room, behaves inappropriately. Gradually, the plan became clear in my mind. Tomorrow morning, Christina will discover that I have locked myself in my bedroom and am not responding to her knocking. She will worry about my condition and call a doctor or even an ambulance. The doctor would find me in a state of confusion after taking unknown drugs. This would be a reason to talk about my incapacity, the need for constant supervision, and the impossibility of living independently. And the trip to Sunny Hills the day after tomorrow would turn out to be not a familiarization trip, but a move to a permanent place of residence, at least until they sort out all the formalities with the house and property. I got up and paced around the room, considering my options. The door is locked, I don't have the keys, and the window is too high to climb out of safely. There was no phone in the bedroom. All calls were answered on the living room phone or on the cell phone, which was charging in the kitchen. Christina, of course, made sure I had no way of calling for help, but they didn't take one thing into account. I didn't take their sleeping pills. Tomorrow morning, I'll be fully conscious and able to thwart their plans. The only question is how to do it without looking like a paranoid person who suspects their relatives of non-existent conspiracies. The clock showed midnight. The house was silent. Even the creaking of the floorboards had stopped. Christina and James had apparently gone to bed, satisfied that the first part of their plan had been successfully executed. They thought I was fast asleep under the influence of the pills, locked in my room and unable to interfere with their actions. I went to the dresser and opened the top drawer. Among the handkerchiefs and cufflinks lay a small notebook in which I kept important phone numbers and addresses. My brother Charles's number in Dallas was written on the first page. If I had a phone, I could call him right now, tell him about the situation, and ask for help. Charles had always been the more decisive of the two of us. He wouldn't waste time sorting out the intricacies of family relationships. He would come, deal with the situation, and put everyone in their place. But I wouldn't be able to contact him until tomorrow, when Christina released me from confinement. For now, all I could do was wait and plan. I thought about what to say, how to behave, what words to choose to ruin their plan, not giving them the opportunity to portray me as an inadequate old man. I returned to my chair and covered myself with a blanket. I didn't want to sleep, and I shouldn't have. I had to stay alert. Who knows, maybe they would decide to check on me again in the middle of the night or take some additional action. A car drove by outside the window, its headlights illuminating the trees along the road. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and another barked back. The usual nighttime sounds of a small town, which used to calm me down. Now I listened to every rustle, waiting for new sounds to come from the house. But the house was silent. Christina and James seemed to have gone to bed, satisfied with their work. They thought they were in control, that everything was going according to plan. Tomorrow they would find out how wrong they were. I sat in my chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching the moon's shadows slowly move across the floor. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. But I was patient. A long life had taught me to wait, to reflect, to make thoughtful decisions. In the morning, a new game will begin. And this time, I will be ready for it. Dawn came slowly, as it does in October, when the days grow shorter and the nights grow longer. Gray light gradually penetrated through the curtains, transforming the dark corners of the room into familiar outlines of furniture. I sat in my chair all night, dozing intermittently, but unable to fall asleep properly. Every sound in the house made me tense, expecting new troubles. The clock on the dresser showed 7 in the morning when I heard movement in the house. First, the stairs creaked as someone descended to the first floor. Then I heard sounds from the kitchen, the murmur of water, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of a frying pan. Christina was making breakfast as usual. It was as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't locked me in my own bedroom the night before. James was probably still asleep. He was never an early riser, preferring to laze in bed until the last possible moment. On work days, he had to be woken up, and on weekends, he could sleep until noon. Christina often complained about this habit of his, but today she was probably happy to be able to do things on her own, without having to worry about her husband's opinion. The smells of breakfast, fried bacon, fresh coffee, toasted bread, drifted into my room, reminding me that life goes on. My stomach responded to these aromas with a hungry growl. I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday's dinner, and my body was demanding food, but breakfast would have to wait. First, I had to play the part Christina had prepared for me. The sounds from the kitchen died down. Christina had apparently finished cooking and was now deciding when to begin the next act of her performance. I imagined her standing in the middle of the kitchen, holding a tray of breakfast, rehearsing the words she would say to me. She was supposed to look concerned that I wasn't coming out of my room, surprised that the door was locked, and ready to help me in my painful condition. 15 minutes later, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She walked slowly, carefully, as if afraid of waking me if I was still asleep. In reality, of course, she was checking to see if the sleeping pill had worn off. "Papa Robert?" Christina's voice came softly from behind the door, with a note of concern. "I brought you breakfast." I didn't answer, continuing to pretend to be fast asleep. Let her think the pills were still working. "Papa Robert, can you hear me?" This time there was a note of concern in her voice, very convincing to an outside listener. Again, silence on my part. "Strange," Christina muttered, clearly expecting me to hear her. "The door is locked. Why did he lock himself in?" I heard the sound of a key turning. The door opened and Christina entered the room with a tray in her hands. She was wearing a neat house dress, her hair was combed, and her makeup was applied with morning care. She looked like a caring relative who was concerned about an elderly family member. "Papa Robert!" she exclaimed with feigned surprise. "What are you doing in the chair? Why aren't you in bed?" I slowly opened my eyes, pretending to be someone who was struggling to wake up from a deep sleep. I rubbed my face with my hands, yawned, and looked at her with a hazy gaze. "Christina, what time is it?" "It's already 8 in the morning," she replied, placing the tray on the table by the window. "Did you sleep in the chair all night?" "Yes. I don't remember how." I tried to speak slowly and uncertainly, like someone who had not yet fully recovered from the effects of strong medication. "My head feels heavy. It's from the pills," Christina quickly explained. "Sometimes they have that effect in the first few days of taking them." She came over to me, took my hand and checked my pulse. Her fingers were cool and her touch felt unpleasantly fake. "Your blood pressure is normal," she stated, "but you look a little disoriented. That's normal at your age." Disoriented. That was exactly the effect she was aiming for. "I brought you breakfast," Christina continued, pointing to the tray. "Your favorite eggs and bacon. And coffee, strong, just the way you like it." I looked at the food. Everything looked appetizing and normal, but after yesterday's incident with the pills, I wasn't sure the food was safe. Who knows what she might have put in the coffee or the eggs? "Thank you, dear," I said, getting up from the chair and pretending to stagger slightly. "Let me wash up first." "Of course," Christina nodded. "While breakfast is cooling down, I want to talk to you about something important." Here it is. The main part of the performance begins. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, and tidied myself up. In the mirror, an elderly man with tired eyes but a steady gaze looked back at me. There were no signs of disorientation or confusion. I had to control my facial expressions. Returning to the bedroom, I sat down at the table and began to eat breakfast. I drank my coffee in careful sips, listening carefully to the taste. There were no foreign flavors, but I still tried to eat slowly. Christina sat on the edge of the bed, folded her hands on her knees, and put on a serious expression. Papa Robert, she began, after yesterday's conversation, James and I thought seriously about the situation. What situation? I asked, continuing to chew the bacon. Your situation, your health, your well-being, your future. She spoke slowly and clearly, as if to someone who might have difficulty understanding. And what conclusion did you come to? We believe you can no longer live alone, Christina said firmly. Yesterday, you locked yourself in your room, spent the whole night in your chair, and don't even remember how it happened. These are alarming symptoms. I understand. That's why we made the decision. Christina stood up and began pacing the room like a lawyer presenting her case. We're transferring you to Sunny Hills next week. I've already contacted the administration, and there's a place available. Without my consent? Papa Robert, Christina turned to me, and a gleam appeared in her eyes that she couldn't hide. In your condition, you can't always make the right decisions. We, as your family, must take responsibility for your safety. What about the house? That's where the good news comes in. Christina smiled broadly, triumphantly. We'll stay here, keep things in order, and maintain the house. In fact, she paused for effect, the house is ours now. Finally. All cards on the table. Ours? I asked calmly. Well, yes. Christina began to speak more quickly, getting carried away with her plan. You can't live here alone, and we need somewhere to live. It's logical, practical, and fair. James is your son. He has a right to his inheritance. Even if I'm still alive? Dad Robert, be realistic. Christina sat back on the bed and leaned forward. You're 74 years old. You have problems with your memory and spatial orientation. How much time do you have left? 5 years? 10? We need to plan our lives now. She spoke bluntly, with the cruel candor she usually hid behind a mask of concern. At last I saw the real Christina, a calculating, selfish woman who believed she had the right to control other people's lives. I see, I said, putting down my fork. So you've already decided everything. We've decided what's best for everyone, Christina confirmed. For you, professional care and interaction with your peers. For us, stability and the ability to make plans. And when does this wonderful plan come into effect? Next week. I'll arrange with the movers and help you pack the necessary things. Sunny Hills has everything you need, so you don't need to take much with you. Christina stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the morning courtyard with the air of a mistress of the house. She was already mentally rearranging the space, planning changes, imagining herself as the rightful owner of the house. There's just one small problem with your plan, I said calmly. What is it? Christina turned to me in surprise. I haven't owned this house for 5 years. Her expression changed instantly. The triumphant smile disappeared. Her eyebrows rose, her mouth opened slightly. What do you mean? I mean that the house belongs to my brother Charles. I transferred everything to him in 2019. Christina was silent for a few seconds, digesting what she had heard. That's impossible, she said finally. You live in this house. You manage it. I live here by agreement with my brother, as a tenant, if you will. Where are the documents? Christina asked sharply. I want to see the documents. The documents are with the notary, but I can show you copies. I got up, walked over to the dresser, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a folder with copies of important papers. Among them was a document certifying the transfer of ownership to Charles Clarkson, certified with seals and signatures. Christina grabbed the document and quickly scanned the lines. Her face paled with every second. It's a forgery, she said in a weak voice. You can check with the notary. Brown and Partners' office on Main Street. They remember this deal. Christina sank to the edge of the bed, still holding the document in her hands. Her carefully constructed plan was crumbling before her eyes. But why? She asked, almost in a whisper. Why did you do this? Because, I replied calmly. I didn't trust my son and his wife. Christina sat on the edge of the bed, holding the deed in her hands as if hoping that the letters on the paper would magically change and turn into what she wanted to see. Her face gradually took on an unhealthy pale gray hue, and her lips pressed into a thin line. I watched her reaction with professional interest. Over many years of working in an insurance company, I had learned to read people by their facial expressions, especially at moments when their plans were falling apart. This can't be true, she repeated, but less confidently than the first time. You couldn't have done that. James is your son, your flesh and blood. How could you deprive him of his inheritance? I didn't deprive anyone of their inheritance, I replied calmly, sitting back down at the breakfast table. The eggs had cooled, but the coffee was still pleasantly warm. I just took precautions. What precautions? Her voice took on a hysterical tone. Exactly the ones that were necessary, judging by last night. Christina jumped out of bed and began pacing nervously around the room, stopping every now and then to turn to me with new questions. When exactly did you do that? And why didn't James know anything about it? Because it didn't concern James. It's my house, and I had the right to do with it as I saw fit. But Charles lives in Texas. Why would he need a house in Oklahoma? Charles is my brother, and I trust him more than anyone else in the world, I replied, watching her reaction closely. He understands that I want to live out my days peacefully in my own home, not in a nursing home while someone else enjoys the fruits of my labor. Christina stopped in the middle of the room, and I saw panic flash in her eyes. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen her plans. The house she already considered her own actually belonged to a man she had never even met. But you didn't tell Charles about our plans? She asked cautiously. About your plans to lock me in my own bedroom and send me to a nursing home? I allowed myself a cold smile. Not yet, but I think he'll be interested to hear how well you're taking care of his brother. Christina's face grew even paler. She sank into the armchair by the window, as if her legs had given way beneath her. You don't understand, she began, shifting from aggression to attempts at justification. We were just concerned about your health. Yesterday you really looked bad. Forgetful. Forgetful, I interrupted her. Christina, stop pretending. We both know what happened last night. You gave me unknown pills, locked me in a room, and took my keys. That's not caring about my health. That's coercion. Those pills were just vitamins, she exclaimed, but her voice was trembling. Vitamins with a bitter taste that made you want to sleep? I shook my head. Let's not lie to each other. We still have time for an honest conversation before James arrives. As if in response to my words, there were sounds in the house, the creaking of stairs, the sound of a door opening, footsteps in the hallway. James had finally woken up and was coming downstairs. A few minutes later, he appeared in the bedroom doorway, disheveled in his pajamas, with a cup of coffee in his hand. Good morning, Dad, he said, but when he saw the look on his wife's face, he immediately became alert. What's going on? Christina silently handed him the document about the transfer of ownership. James took the paper, read it, and his face gradually took on the same pale expression his wife had had a few minutes earlier. Dad, he said slowly, is this true? Absolutely true, I confirmed. But when? Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't see the need to discuss it with you then. And now, after yesterday's events, I see that I made the right decision. James sank down on the sofa, put his cup on the floor, and buried his face in his hands. I don't understand, he muttered. Do you really trust us so little? James, I said more gently, I trusted you as a son, but I didn't trust your ability to resist your wife's influence. That's not fair, Christina snapped. You make me out to be some kind of witch who brainwashes your son. Isn't that what you're doing? I looked her straight in the eye. James was never the initiator of your plans. He just followed you, as always. We wanted to help you. Christina jumped up from her chair, her voice rising. We saw that you were having trouble managing the house, that you were becoming more withdrawn, that your health was deteriorating. My health is perfectly fine for a man of my age. And I became withdrawn because I sensed you were making plans for my life. James raised his head and looked at me with a pained expression. Dad, do you really think we wanted to hurt you? I paused, considering my answer. James was not a malicious person, but he was weak. And weak people often cause harm not out of malice, but out of an inability to resist outside influence. I think you let Christine convince you that I needed help, which just happened to coincide with your interests. But the nursing home, we really thought you'd be better off there. James, I interrupted him, did you ever ask me if I wanted to move into a nursing home? Or did you just start looking for a suitable facility right away? He remained silent, which was an answer in itself. Meanwhile, Christine paced around the room, clearly weighing her options. I could see her brain working, sorting through the possibilities to save the situation. She was a smart woman, though not a very honest one. Okay, she said finally, stopping and turning to face us. Let's say the house belongs to Charles. But you live here, and you have rights as a tenant, and we have rights as relatives who care for you. What right? I asked. The right to be concerned about your health. The right to insist on a medical examination if we see signs of dementia or other age-related changes. She was trying to find a new approach, but I was ready for that too. Christina, any doctor will tell you that I have no signs of dementia. My memory, thinking, and ability to care for myself are completely intact. What about last night? She insisted. You locked yourself in your room, slept in a chair, and were disoriented in the morning. I didn't lock myself in my room. I was locked in. I spoke calmly but firmly. You gave me some pills, waited until I supposedly fell asleep, then locked the door from the outside and took my keys. That's absurd, Christina exclaimed, but her voice lacked its former confidence. Then explained to me how I could have locked myself in the room from the inside, but the key was outside? There was a silence. Christina and James exchanged glances, and I saw that my son was beginning to understand what had really happened. Christina, James said quietly, did you really lock Dad in his room? I wanted to make sure he didn't walk around the house at night and fall, she replied, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. And the pills, they were just regular tranquilizers. Dr. Harrison said that at his age it's good to take mild sedatives. Dr. Harrison never said anything like that to me, I said, and those pills were definitely not the ones he prescribed for me. James got up from the sofa and walked over to the window, turning his back on us. I could see how tense his shoulders were, how he was clenching and unclenching his fists. He understood that he had become part of something wrong, and it was causing him pain. What do we do now? He asked without turning around. First, we need to contact Charles, I replied. Tell him what's going on and invite him to come over. Why? Christina asked quickly. Because it's his house, and he should know how his brother is being treated there. But we can work this out between ourselves, she tried. Why bring in outsiders? Charles isn't an outsider. He's my brother and the owner of this house. Christina sank into a chair, and I saw that she was close to tears. Not out of remorse, but out of anger that her plan had failed. How long will it take Charles to get here? James asked, still standing by the window. He can fly out tomorrow morning and be here by evening. That is, if he can get away from his work. And until he arrives? There was a new note in Christina's voice. Until he arrives, we live like civilized people, I replied. No one locks anyone up, gives them extra pills, or makes plans against other people's will. And everything stays the same. Until Charles decides otherwise, yes. Christina stood up and headed for the door. I need to think, she said. This is all too sudden. After she left, James turned to me. His eyes showed shame and confusion. Dad, he began, I didn't know about the pills or the locking. Christina said you asked for extra security measures. And you believed her. I wanted to believe her. I thought we were really helping you. James, I said gently, you're my son, and I love you. But you have to learn to think for yourself, not rely on other people's decisions. He nodded, but I could see that my words were hurting him. Still, sometimes the painful truth is necessary. What happens now? He asked. Now I call Charles and tell him the whole story. Then we'll see what he decides to do next. What if he asks us to leave? I looked at my son and saw fear in his eyes. Fear of being left without a roof over his head, without the stability that my home provided. That will be his decision, I replied, and I will understand it. After talking to James, I was left alone in the bedroom, thinking about the situation. My son had gone upstairs, probably to have a serious conversation with his wife about how their plans had been ruined. I could hear muffled voices coming from their room. At first, Christina was speaking quickly and excitedly. Then James responded in a calmer tone. From time to time, Christina's voice rose, but it was impossible to make out the words. I finished my breakfast, which had cooled down completely by then, and waited to see how things would unfold. Experience told me that Christina would not give up so easily. She had spent too much time and effort planning my relocation to simply retreat at the first setback. Women of her ilk are not accustomed to losing without a fight. Around noon, the voices upstairs subsided, and soon I heard Christina coming down the stairs. Her steps sounded determined but not aggressive. She had clearly come up with a new strategy. She walked around the first floor for a few minutes, did something in the kitchen, then headed toward me. The knock on the door was soft, almost timid. "Papa Robert, may I come in?" "Of course." Christina entered the room completely transformed. If in the morning she had looked like a woman whose plans had fallen apart, now I was looking at an exemplary daughter-in-law. With a guilty expression on her face, her eyes downcast and a repentant look. She had even changed into a more modest dress and put her hair up in a simple hairstyle. "I brought you some tea," she said, placing a tray with a cup and cookies on the table. "I'm sorry for this morning's misunderstanding." "What misunderstanding do you mean?" "I want to talk to you honestly." Christina sat down in the chair opposite me, folded her hands on her knees, and looked me in the eyes with an expression of sincere remorse. "About what happened last night and this morning." I picked up the cup of tea and sniffed it. It was ordinary black tea with no strange smells. But after yesterday's incident with the pills, I decided to be cautious and drink it in small sips. "I'm listening." "I understand that my actions may have seemed strange or even frightening to you," Christina began in a tone of contrition, "but I want to explain what motivated me." "Explain." "Over the last few months, I've noticed that you've become more vulnerable. Not physically, no, but emotionally. Aunt Margaret's death affected you deeply. You became withdrawn, sometimes distracted. And I began to worry." Aunt Margaret. That's what she always called my late wife, even though they weren't related. Another attempt to create the illusion of closeness. Continue. "I read a lot of articles about elderly people who live alone after losing their life partner, about how important it is to monitor their condition, how easy it is to miss the onset of serious problems. And I felt I had to take action." Christina spoke in a sincere tone, pausing from time to time, as if searching for the right words. She was a good actress. I have to give her that. "The pills I gave you," she continued, "were actually mild sedatives. I consulted with a pharmacist, explained the situation, and he recommended this particular medication." "Which pharmacist?" "At the pharmacy on Fifth Avenue. Mr. Green, he's been working there for many years. Curiously, she even had the name and location ready in case I wanted to check. But I knew Mr. Green personally, and he would never give out medication without a doctor's prescription, especially to an elderly person." "Why did you lock me in my room?" "It was my mistake," Christina quickly admitted. "A stupid, rash mistake. I thought that if you got up at night under the influence of the sedative, you might fall or hurt yourself. I wanted the best for you." "And you took my keys for my own safety too?" Yes, I was afraid that in your confused state, you might try to leave the house at night." Each of her explanations sounded almost plausible, but taken together, they formed a picture that did not stand up to scrutiny. Christina tried to present her actions as concern that went beyond reasonable limits, rather than a deliberate attempt to deprive me of my freedom. "I see," I said neutrally. "And now what?" "Now I ask for your forgiveness." Christina leaned forward, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand that I caused you suffering, made you feel like a prisoner in your own home. It's terrible, and I'm very ashamed. What about the plans for the nursing home?" "Forget about them," she exclaimed. "It was nonsense, a stupid idea born of excessive concern. You're doing just fine on your own, and no one has the right to force you to move. And your statements that the house is now yours?" "Emotions," Christina waved her hand. "Silly words spoken in a moment of distress. Of course, the house belongs to your brother, and we are just guests here. Very grateful guests." I listened to this confession with growing amazement. Christina was trying to present the whole story as a series of misunderstandings caused by excessive concern. She seemed to hope that I would believe in the possibility of such a large-scale self-deception on her part. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "Let's forget about all this," she said passionately. "Let's start with a clean slate. I promise never to interfere in your affairs without your permission again. No pills, no locked doors, no plans behind your back." "And your husband agrees with this?" "James understands that we were wrong. He wants to fix things too." "And you think we can just forget about what happened?" "Why not?" Christina tried to smile. "No one was really hurt." "No one was hurt. It's just a family misunderstanding. A family misunderstanding. What an elegant euphemism for attempting to deprive a person of their freedom and legal capacity. Do you want us to keep what happened from Charles? Why upset him? Christina said quickly. He lives far away. He has his own business, his own concerns. Why drag him into our petty family problems? There it was, the real reason for her remorse. Christina was afraid that Charles would find out what had happened and take action. She hoped to convince me to keep quiet about what had happened in order to maintain the status quo. Christina, I said gently, what makes you think I'll believe your apology is sincere? Because I really regret what happened, she exclaimed. Because I'm ready to prove that I've changed. How exactly? I'll give you back all your keys. I will never look at your documents again. I will not interfere with your daily routine or offer you unnecessary medication. You will be the rightful owner of this house, and James and I will be just tenants. Tenants usually pay for their accommodation. We can discuss it, Christina hastily agreed. We'll find a fair solution that works for everyone. I finished my tea and placed the cup on the tray. Christina watched my every move, trying to guess whether her words had made an impression. I need time to think about your offer, I finally said. Of course, she said happily. But you won't call Charles today, will you? Give us a chance to prove that we've really changed. Maybe. Thank you. Christina jumped up from her chair. You won't regret this decision. I'll prove to you that I'm trustworthy. After she left, I was left alone, thinking about what had just happened. Christina tried to play the remorse card and promised to change, but I wasn't naive enough to believe in such a sudden transformation. People like her cannot be reformed. They can only temporarily change their tactics. Nevertheless, her new strategy gave me some advantages. While she plays the role of a repentant daughter-in-law, I can move around the house relatively freely and take the necessary actions. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard the sound of the front door opening. Christina had returned from somewhere outside, judging by the sound of her heels in the hallway. She did something in the kitchen, then went upstairs to her room. Half an hour later, James came downstairs, went into the kitchen, talked to his wife there, and then came to me. Dad, can we talk? Of course. James entered the room and sat down on the sofa. He looked tired and depressed. Apparently, the conversation with Christina had not been easy for him. She told me about your conversation, he said, about how she apologized and asked to give us another chance. And what do you think about that? I think we really made a mistake, a big, serious mistake, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it, even if it means going against your wife's wishes. James paused, considering his answer. Yes, even that. You're my father, and I had no right to let her treat you that way. What if Christina tries again to convince you that she needs to take care of me? I'll be more attentive. I'll ask more questions, demand explanations. I looked at my son and saw in his eyes a sincere desire to make amends. James wasn't a bad person, just weak and easily influenced. But even weak people sometimes find the strength to do the right thing. All right, I said, let's see how things develop. You're not going to call Uncle Charles? Not yet, but I reserve the right to do so at any time if something goes wrong. Fair enough, James agreed. After he left, I waited until the house was relatively quiet and quietly left the bedroom. My keys were indeed on the table in the hall. Christina had kept her promise to return them. I picked up the bunch and headed for the phone in the living room. First, I dialed Charles's number in Dallas. The phone was answered after the third ring. Robert, my brother's voice exclaimed happily. How are you, old man? Not very well, Charlie. I need to tell you something important. I recounted the whole story in detail, from my initial suspicions to Christina's apology that morning. Charles listened silently, only occasionally asking clarifying questions. Sons of bitches? He cursed when I finished my story. They thought you were an old fool who could be fooled. What are you going to do? I'm flying out to see you tomorrow. I'll deal with these parasites myself. Charlie, don't rush into anything. They're behaving themselves for now. Maybe we should give them a chance. Robert, you're too kind. These people tried to take away your freedom. Things like that aren't forgiven. Think about it. If they really change, what if they don't? What if it's just a ploy? Are you willing to take that risk? I paused. Charles was right. It would be naive to trust Christine after everything that had happened. All right, come on over. But give me a couple of days to observe their behavior. 2 days maximum. If nothing changes by Friday, I'll come anyway. After talking to my brother, I dialed the number of the local police station. The officer on duty listened to my story and promised to send a patrol car for a preventive visit. We can't open a case without concrete evidence, he explained. But we can talk to your relatives and explain the possible consequences of their actions. That will be enough for now. I returned to the bedroom and sat down in an armchair, feeling some relief. The plan of action was ready, support was secured. Now all that remained was to wait and see how Christina and James would behave, knowing that their game had been exposed, but thinking that they had been given a second chance. The next 2 days passed in a strange atmosphere of tense calm. Christina and James tried to behave impeccably. She cooked my favorite dishes, asked how I was feeling, offered to help with household chores, but didn't insist when I politely declined. James spent more time with me than usual, talking about work, discussing the news, even suggesting that we look at old family photos together. It all seemed touching and sincere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a well-staged performance. They were trying too hard to portray themselves as caring relatives, too carefully avoiding any topics that might remind me of recent events. When I mentioned plans for the future or said something about the documents, I saw a flicker of alarm in their eyes, although they immediately covered it up with smiles. On Tuesday evening, I received a call from Charles. "Robert, how are things? Are they behaving themselves?" "So far, yes," I replied, lowering my voice and glancing toward the living room, where Christina and James were watching television. "They're playing the part of model relatives. Pretending is the key word. I'll fly in tomorrow morning and be at your place around 2 o'clock. Alone?" "With Sergeant Miller from the local police. You did talk to them, right?" "Yes, I gave them a heads up. They promised to help if necessary." "Great. Tomorrow we'll find out everything for sure." On Wednesday morning, I got up earlier than usual and spent some time watching the familiar life at home. Christina was making breakfast, humming something under her breath, a habit that used to seem cute, but now annoyed me with its falseness. James was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, commenting on the news from time to time. It was a typical family morning scene, but I knew that in a few hours this idyll would be over. Around noon, I said I was expecting guests. "What guests?" Christina asked, interrupting her cleaning in the living room. "My brother Charles. He's flying in from Dallas." Her expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared, and a flicker of alarm crossed her eyes. "Why is he coming? Has something happened?" "Nothing special. We haven't seen each other in a long time, so he decided to visit." "But you said you wouldn't bother him with our family problems." "I said I'd think about it, and I did." James put down the newspaper and looked at me with growing concern. "Dad, you didn't tell him about the misunderstanding, did you?" "Why should I hide the truth from the owner of the house?" Christina and James exchanged glances. I could see panic gradually taking hold of them. All their efforts over the last 2 days, all their ostentatious concern, it had all been in vain. "When will he be here?" Christina asked quietly. "Around 2 o'clock. Maybe I should prepare something special?" She was trying to maintain an appearance of normality. "To entertain your brother?" "Don't worry about it. It's a business meeting." At 1:30, I heard the sound of cars pulling up. Looking out the window, I saw a taxi from which Charles was getting out with a small suitcase, followed by a police car. A man in plain clothes got out of it who, judging by his confident gait and attentive gaze, was Sergeant Miller himself. Charles had changed little in the 2 years since we had last seen each other. He was 3 years younger than me, but looked younger than his 71 years. Tall, lean, with gray hair and sharp gray eyes. Years of working as a building contractor had left their mark on his character. He had no patience for nonsense and didn't like to waste time on long explanations. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. "I'll get it," I said to Christine, who was fidgeting nervously in the hallway. Charles and a man in his 50s wearing a dark suit were standing on the doorstep. "Robert!" Charles hugged me tightly like a brother. "How are you holding up?" "Not bad considering the circumstances." I turned to his companion. "And you, I presume, are Sergeant Miller?" "That's right," he nodded, shaking my hand. "Detective Miller, Senior Citizens Division. We got your call." "Please come in." Christina and James were waiting for us in the living room. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap, while he stood by the window, nervously fiddling with the curtain. They both looked like defendants awaiting sentencing. "James, meet your Uncle Charles," I said. "You haven't seen each other in a very long time." James approached and tentatively extended his hand. Charles shook it, studying his nephew's face intently. "And this is Christina, James's wife," I continued, "and Detective Miller from the local police." "The police?" Christina asked in a weak voice. "Why?" "And you are obviously the sister-in-law who took care of my brother," Charles said coldly. "Robert told me many interesting things about your care." Detective Miller took out a notebook and pen and settled into a chair. "Mr. Clarkson," he said to me, "please tell us in detail about the events that prompted you to contact us." I began my story from the very beginning, with the overheard conversations, Christina and James's strange behavior, and the plans for the nursing home. I described in detail the story of the pills, the locked door, and the stolen keys. Christina and James sat silently, their faces growing paler with every word. "You claim," the detective clarified, "that Mrs. Christina Clarkson gave you unknown drugs under the guise of blood pressure medication?" "That's right. And then she locked you in your own bedroom?" "Yes, and she took the house keys." The detective turned to Christina. "Mrs. Clarkson, what can you say about this?" Christina was silent for a few seconds, then raised her head. It was a misunderstanding," she said in a trembling voice. "I did give him sedatives, but only because I was worried about his condition." "And did you really lock the door?" Yes, but only so that he wouldn't walk around the house at night and fall. Without his consent? He was under the influence of medication. I didn't want to disturb him." "Stop," Charles interrupted her. "What right did you have to give my brother any medication? Are you a doctor? Do you have medical training?" "No, but..." "Then you understand that you committed a crime, forced treatment, deprivation of freedom of movement. These are serious charges." Christina turned even paler. She turned to James for support, but he was standing with his back to her, looking out the window. "James," she exclaimed, "say something." "You know I wanted what was best." James slowly turned to face the group. His eyes showed shame and confusion. I didn't know about the pills," he said quietly. "Christina told me that Dad himself asked for additional security measures." "That's not true," Christina cried. "You knew perfectly well about our plans. You yourself talked about a nursing home. I talked about the possibility, but not about coercion. And who suggested rewriting the will in our name?" Christina was beginning to lose control. "Who said Dad was too old to live alone?" "Christina, be quiet," James asked. "No, I won't be quiet. If I'm being accused, then let everyone know the truth." Detective Miller carefully wrote down every word of their argument. "So you really plan to take possession of Mr. Clarkson's property?" he asked. "We plan to provide him with good care," Christina replied, but her voice no longer sounded convincing. "And the house? The house was going to go to us after his death anyway." "After his death," Charles repeated. "And you didn't rush things? You didn't try to speed up the process?" "What do you mean?" Christina jumped up from the sofa. "I didn't wish anyone harm. I just wanted everything to be done right." "Right for whom?" I asked. "For me or for you?" "For everyone. For the family." "And does the family include the opinion of the person you plan to send to a nursing home?" Charles took a folder of documents out of his briefcase. "Mr. Miller," he said to the detective, "here are the documents proving that I have owned this house for 5 years. My brother lives here as my guest. And these people," he pointed to Christina and James, "tried to seize someone else's property." "We didn't seize anything," exclaimed James. "We just thought..." "What did you think?" Charles asked coldly. "That you could dispose of my property without my knowledge? We didn't know the house was yours." "And if you had known," the detective interjected, "would that have changed your plans?" James remained silent, realizing that any answer would incriminate him. Meanwhile, Christina had completely lost her composure. "Fine," she cried. "Yes, we wanted him to move into a nursing home. Yes, we believed we had a right to this house. What's wrong with that? We're young, we need somewhere to live, to make plans for the future. And he's alone in a huge house and doesn't even appreciate it." "So you admit to attempted coercion?" the detective clarified. "I admit that I tried to help an elderly man make the right decision about his future." Against his will. He didn't know what was best for him. Charles shook his head. Amazing logic. A young woman knows better than a 74-year-old man what he needs in life. Detective Miller closed his notebook. Mr. Charles Clarkson, as the owner of the house, what do you intend to do? I want these people out of my house within 48 hours, and I want them officially prohibited from approaching my brother without his express permission. What about criminal prosecution? Charles looked at me questioningly. I paused, considering my answer. For now, eviction will suffice, I said finally. But if something like this happens again, then we will be forced to press criminal charges, the detective concluded. Coercion, deprivation of liberty, attempted fraud. There are plenty of charges. James came up to me, tears in his eyes. Dad, he said quietly, I'm sorry. I really didn't know how far Christina's plans had gone. I thought, you only thought about yourself, Charles interrupted him. About your own comfort, your own future. You didn't think about your father's feelings. Can I make things right? Can I make up for what I've done? You can, I replied. You can finally become an independent person and stop letting others make decisions for you. Christina stood by the sofa, looking at us all with an expression of poorly concealed hatred. Fine, she said. We'll leave. But don't think it will end so easily. What about your remorse? I asked. Your promises to change? That was before I realized you were just deceiving us, she replied coldly. You gave us false hope, but you've already made up your mind. I didn't deceive anyone. I gave you a chance to prove the sincerity of your remorse. You didn't take it. The detective stood up and put his notebook in his pocket. I have all the necessary evidence, he said. The case will be forwarded to the prosecutor's office for a decision on possible prosecution. For now, this is an official warning and a demand to vacate the house within 2 days. After the police officer left, Charles and I remained alone in the living room. Christina and James went upstairs to pack their things and decide where to go next. Do you think we did the right thing? I asked my brother. Absolutely, Charles replied firmly. People like that need to be stopped right away, without giving them a chance to get started. Otherwise, next time they'll go even further. The next 2 days passed in an atmosphere of cold tension that permeated every corner of the house. Christina and James methodically gathered their belongings, packing into boxes and suitcases everything they had accumulated during 3 years of living together under my roof. The sounds of their activity, the creaking of floorboards, the banging of closing drawers, muffled conversations, created a strange cacophony, reminding me of how quickly the familiar order of things can change. I watched this process with mixed feelings. On the one hand, there was relief that the nightmare of the last few weeks was finally coming to an end. On the other hand, there was sadness at the realization that my son, the only child I had with Margaret, was capable of such betrayal. Years of upbringing, love, support, and this was the result. A man who was willing to send his own father to a nursing home for his own comfort. Charles spent most of his time with me, telling me about his life in Texas, his business, his plans for the future. But I could sense that he was keeping a close eye on the situation, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. My younger brother had always been a protector, taking on the role of problem solver and peacemaker since childhood. Have they found a place to live? He asked on the evening of the second day as we sat in the living room, drinking coffee. James mentioned something about a rental apartment on the other side of town, I replied. Temporarily until they decide what to do next. Does he have a job? He works as a manager in a construction company. The salary is small, but it's enough to live on. Unless, of course, you want a big house in a nice neighborhood? Charles shook his head. It's amazing how quickly people get used to someone else's prosperity and start to consider it their own. From the very beginning, Christina had viewed this house as her future property. And James just let her convince him. Do you still feel sorry for him? I thought about that question. Did I feel sorry for James? Or was I angry with him? Or did I just feel bitter disappointment? I guess I do, I replied honestly. He's not a bad person, Charlie. He's just weak. And that weakness made him an accomplice to other people's plans. Weakness is no excuse when it comes to betraying your own father. I know, but he's still my son. On the morning of the third day, a truck pulled up to the house. Christina had hired movers to take away the furniture and large items. I stood at the window watching as they carried out the sofa they had bought in their first year of living together, the kitchen set that Christina had chosen with such enthusiasm, the TV we had all watched evening programs on together. It was strange to see the house gradually being cleared of traces of their presence. The rooms that had seemed occupied and lived in for 3 years were becoming empty again. The walls where their photos had hung were bare. The shelves filled with their books and knickknacks were empty. James came up to me several times trying to talk, but I could see he didn't know what to say. Apologies had been made, explanations given, but forgiveness had not followed. Between us hung the awkwardness of people who know their relationship has changed forever. "Dad," he said as the movers carried out the last box of his belongings, "I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you." "I know," I replied, "but you did. Can we ever fix this?" I looked at him, my son, who was about to turn 47, but who still waited for someone else to decide for him what to do and how to live. "I don't know, James. It depends on you. It depends on whether you can become the person I wanted you to be." "What does that mean?" "It means learning to make your own decisions, taking responsibility for your actions, not letting other people use your weakness to achieve their goals." James nodded, but I saw no confidence in his eyes. He understood my words with his mind, but his heart had not yet accepted them. Christina appeared in the hallway with the last bag in her hands. She was dressed for travel, her hair neatly styled, her makeup flawless. Even in defeat, she maintained her dignity and did not allow herself to look defeated. "We're leaving," she said, addressing both Charles and me. "I hope you're satisfied with the outcome." "Christina," I said calmly, "the outcome is a consequence of your actions, not our desires." "You could show some understanding," she replied. "We were genuinely concerned for your well-being." "No," Charles shook his head. "You were concerned for your own well-being, and you tried to pass off selfishness as concern." Christina pressed her lips together, holding back the harsh words that were apparently ready to spill out. "Well," she said finally, "time will tell who was right." "Time has already told," I replied. She headed for the door, James following her. At the threshold, he turned around once more. "Dad, if anything happens, if you need me, I know where to find you. Will you call?" "We'll see." The door closed behind them, and silence fell over the house. Not the tense silence of the last few days, but the calm, peaceful silence of a home where people understand each other. Charles and I stood in the hallway, listening to the car start outside, the sound of the engine gradually fading away down the street. "There," said Charles. "Now we can live in peace." "Yes," I agreed. "Now we can." We walked into the living room, which seemed more spacious without the unfamiliar furniture. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust particles in the air. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "Charlie," I said, sitting down in my old chair, "thank you for coming, for your support, for not letting them get their way." "No need to thank me," he replied. "We're brothers, and brothers help each other." "What now? Are you going back to Texas?" Charles paused, looking out the window at the street where James and Christina had just driven away. "You know, Robert, I think I'm going to stay here." "Seriously?" "Absolutely. All I have left in Dallas are business connections. No family, no close friends. But here I have you, the house we grew up in, memories. Maybe it's time to go back to my roots." "But your business, you can run a business from anywhere these days. Besides, I'm not young enough to chase new contracts anymore. It's time to think about how to spend the rest of my life." I looked at my brother and realized that his decision was not accidental. He saw how close I came to disaster, how easily I could have lost not only my home, but also my freedom, my dignity, my right to control my own life. And he didn't want to leave me alone in the face of possible new threats. "Won't you be bored in Oklahoma City after Dallas?" "Aren't you bored after all these years?" "No," I replied honestly, "especially now that I know I'll have someone I can trust nearby." We sat in silence, each thinking our own thoughts. Outside the window, people walked by, cars drove by, life continued its usual course. But for me, it was starting over, without fear, without suspicion, without the need to constantly look over my shoulder. "Robert," Charles said, "what about James? Are you really not going to maintain a relationship with him?" "I don't know," I replied after a pause. "I'm not ready yet. The wounds are too fresh, too much pain has been caused. Maybe in time, what if he changes? What if he really learns to be independent? Then we'll see. But so far, I don't see any signs of such changes. He left with Christina, even though he could have stayed and tried to repair his relationship with me. That speaks to his priorities. He chose his wife. He chose the easy way out, as always. Charles nodded. He understood my pain and didn't try to convince me otherwise. Some wounds heal only with time, and some relationships can only be restored through radical changes in people. In the evening, we went to a restaurant for dinner. For the first time in many months, I could eat without fear that unknown drugs had been mixed into my food. The waitress was friendly, the food was delicious, and the atmosphere was calm. We talked about plans for the future, about renovating the house, about how to build a life together. "Don't you regret how it all ended?" Charles asked as we were driving home. "What exactly?" "James, the fact that the family fell apart." I thought about his question. Did I regret it, or did I feel relieved? You know, Charlie, a family should be built on love and mutual respect. What we had these last few months couldn't be called a family. It was more like a play, where everyone played their part without showing their true selves. "And you prefer the truth, even if it's painful?" "Yes," I replied confidently. "I do, because only the truth can build real relationships." We entered the house that was truly ours again. We turned on the light in the living room, made tea, and sat down in the armchairs by the window. Outside the window, the lights of the evening city were coming on, and that light seemed warmer than ever before. "Tomorrow we'll start a new life," Charles said. "Yes," I agreed. "A new life, an honest, peaceful life, without lies and pretense." And in those words was a truth that warmed the soul more than any fire.